Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the DSA Virtual Access event focused on the retail road ahead for downtown. Thanks to DSA for organizing the series and to Alaska Airlines, the newest member of One World Alliance, and for their support. And now let's hear from our presenting sponsor and hometown airline about how they're using innovative solutions to help us fly greener.
Hi, we're Alaska Airlines. As the only airline based on the West Coast, innovation is in our DNA. Over the years, we've helped aviation evolve to be safer, more reliable, and provide a better experience for our guests. Now we've set our most audacious environmental goal ever, net zero carbon emissions by 2040. But as a company that burns 750 million gallons of fuel every year, it's going to take a lot more than just changing our light bulbs. We must continue to invest and pursue pioneering technologies that will change the industry. We're advancing the viability of sustainable aviation fuel, which we've been using for over a decade. We're exploring novel propulsion methods that use electric or alternative power. In partnership with Boeing, we launched our Eco Demonstrator 737 to make flying safer, quieter, and more efficient. And in 2021, we became the first airline in the world to use Flyways, a system that uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to help our dispatchers determine the safest and most efficient flight plans. We reduced the average flight times by 5 minutes and saved 480,000 gallons of fuel in just 6 months. Who knows what our future will bring? But at Alaska, we know that we'll be leading the way. Let's go.
All right, I feel positively cleared for takeoff after that video. Thank Alaska again for supporting the project and this series. I want to thank and introduce the distinguished panelists who will be taking part in the conversation this morning. Michael J. Byrne is president of MJB Consulting, a retail planning and real estate consulting firm based in New York City and the Bay Area. MJB Consulting works with public, nonprofit, and private sector clients to undertake market analyses, devise tenanting strategies, and spearhead implementation efforts. Michael's also the author of the Retail Contrarian blog. Tiffany Connell is principal and managing broker for West Coast Commercial Realty in Seattle. She's been with the company for more than 17 years, specializes in commercial property lease and sale brokerage in the retail sector. Tiffany helps clients with goals around investment value, tenant mix, and property positioning through successful property marketing and execution of lease and sale transactions. And our third panelist is Sandy Lou Haler. She's an artist and the owner and creative spirit behind Sandy Lou. It's a distinctive women's clothing store between Pike and Union on First Avenue that's been in business for nearly 50 years. Sandy Lou the Shop is an extension of Sandy's life as a visual artist and is about choosing clothing so we can all have fun getting dressed. All right. Now we do have some questions we have prepared in advance, and we'll get to the live audience questions in the last portion of the program. But as Emily said, I do encourage you, if you have any thoughts or questions, anything you want to share during the program, we monitor the Q&A box and the chat function. So please hop in there anytime you feel like it. And we do monitor those, and we'll bring those forward, when it fits into the conversation or just to shift the direction at times. Now, before we get the formal conversation underway, informally, downtown, the mood has changed. The mood is different. It's better than it was. It feels like we're, if not exactly post-Delta variant, we're sort of nearly post-Delta variant. Before we talk about the mood, though, I want to set the scene with a few specific data points from some of the research that DSA monitors and prepares. First of all, in terms of downtown Seattle's share of the city's retail industry, downtown historically has represented about a third of brick and mortar retail sales, more than a third of leisure spending within the city of Seattle, which includes dining. In terms of visitor and foot traffic, retail foot traffic has been returning to downtown after reaching a low point of 17% of the 2019 baseline. By the summer of 2021, foot traffic to retail and dining establishments rose to more than 60% compared to the same months in 2019. Now, a big one for this group, retail vacancy. The downtown retail vacancy rate is now at its highest level since 2009 at 4.5%. This compares to a regional vacancy rate of 2.8% and a national rate of 4.9%. And while more than 500 street level business locations have permanently closed in downtown since January 2020, 270 new street level locations have opened during the same period. All right. So my first job was in retail in downtown Seattle almost 40 years ago. I've always loved the vibe and the feel and the way you're at the heart of the city when you're in shopping in the downtown area. And there's been a lot of conversation about closures and vacancy as those data points reveal. So to help set that scene, I'd like to kind of compare that rate to other parts of the country, peer markets, in terms of the status of retail in downtown Seattle. And Michael, maybe that's a question for you to address.
Yeah. You hear me okay, Felix?
Yeah, very good.
4.5% is, I believe, the number you gave. Actually, even in normal times, 4.5%, while a little higher than what downtown Seattle might be accustomed to, is well below the threshold generally considered to be healthy. Generally, business districts with retail vacancy below 10% are considered healthy. You actually don't want to get too low with that number. So that's just in normal times. Obviously, the last 20 or so months have been particularly hard on central business districts, variety of reasons for that, but they tend to have been the business districts, even within cities, that have struggled the most, given their reliance on office workers and in many CBDs, transit, as well as business travel, conventioneers, tourists, a lot of which just kind of disappeared overnight last spring. And so if you look at the CBDs across the country, 4.5% is something that most of them would kill for at this point. Just to give you a few numbers as a frame of reference. And again, these are percentages taken last 3 or 4 months, and it's very fast moving. But this should just give you a sense of the scale. Here in San Francisco, we're currently looking at anywhere between 26 to 36% retail vacancy in Union Square. Times Square and Soho, both well above 25%. Madison Avenue, about 39%. Magnificent Mile in Chicago is 19%. The Loop in Chicago is 26%. Downtown DC is 23%. Georgetown is 17%. As you can see, 4.5%. Extremely healthy, considering that this is a central business district, and also considering that downtown Seattle has long had a large number of national brands, which somewhat counterintuitively have been the tenants that have actually fared the worst during this pandemic. I think all things considered, 4.5% is pretty miraculous.
All right. Now, Tiffany Connell, in terms of the work you're doing, what are you seeing in terms of the vacancy rate and how it's affecting your clients?
Oh, I completely agree. Michael and I were talking about this a little bit. One of the things that's super unique about Puget Sound in general is how independent our retail market is. And by the way, I use retail, which encompasses, of course, restaurants, hospitality, sort of anything that energizes a ground floor of anything. And we've always had a very strong independent market. And my experience after the last recession is almost identical to what's happening right now, which is the small businesses and the independent nature of those businesses is actually taking us out of this. And that is happening right now. So while we started seeing a pretty significant comeback in activity of people wanting to open new locations, second locations, third locations, et cetera, starting at the beginning of this year, and frankly, even parts of last year, we are also now seeing that the national retailers who, look at different pockets around the country for expansion. I mean, if you're in retail, you got to stay in retail and you got to figure out where you're going to go next. And they have targeted Seattle. And so we are in a very unique position currently where they're really kind of battling it out for who's going to have, specific spaces around the whole region. And of course, that includes downtown. So we were talking about how there's some very unusual, highly curated concepts. I can't speak to them. We'll have to wait till they're in the news, but that are looking at Seattle and kind of picking this as their next 1 or 2 locations in the whole country. So it's a very positive story that starts with really how independent we are. And that just obviously lends itself towards that spirit of I think that the Northwest has about resilience and moving forwd. I think Sandy's a perfect example of that.
I was going to say, you stole my segue. I was going to say, speaking of independent retailers with that independent spirit, Sandy Lou Haler, is this resonating for you? Are there things that you've been doing that you couldn't do if you were a branch office of some bigger retailer, or what's worked for you that other people might be able to steal your ideas from?
That's funny. This is a time when we are all kind of being very flexible, and we have to be very creative, right, about how we are approaching what we don't know.
Mhm.
However, I started business in 2008. So in 2009, the year that Michael is referring to, it felt very different, oddly, from right this moment. I mean, 2019, 2020, something totally different. But if you compare, for me, 2009 and 2021, this is very different. There are more, I'm on First Avenue, there are more shops that are still open. I believe that this really points the finger toward how we are a community, how the locally owned buildings, the local owners of buildings, or corporate that understands local have made it possible for little retailers like me to stay in business. It's really a partnership between all the things that happen to you, not just the customers. And of course, now, as Michael said, there are more people walking around. The Pike Place market area is very lively, and it's sort of filtering back. I think there are more tourists, and there are more people visiting their families. And there are oddly people who come to Seattle and come into my store and say out loud, when I ask, why did you come to Seattle? Oh, I wanted to get out of the heat and it seems safe here. Seriously, this is a common response. I mean, everything I say is anecdotal, but still, it's a common response.
And that's consistent with what we heard the last time we got together in virtual access, was this notion that Seattle, in terms of the pandemic, Seattle was viewed as very safe, while those public safety issues that have been plaguing us since before the pandemic are still there. They've been backburnered somewhat by this, fear of death or serious illness from the pandemic. Now, Sandy, it sounds like you're talking about this sort of informal relationships and commitment by building owners and small businesses to do things, to band together. Is there room, or do you think there are things that could be done formally to strengthen those efforts? Or Michael, maybe there's something other parts of the country. Are these informal networks of smaller independent businesses banding together to do things to increase traffic and sales? Michael, go ahead. You go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think there's two parts to it. I think one part of it is, yes, that kind of on the ground creative collaboration. I think the other part of it is market driven as well. Seattle is, as we know, a powerhouse regional economy with some of the largest and fastest growing companies in this country. We shouldn't discount that, but also, and this is something which puts it in a league with another CBD that has fared reasonably well through all of this, Philadelphia. It has significantly grown its in-town residential population. And again, if you look at the business districts across urban America that have done well or have been reasonably stable during all this, it's the ones that had that built-in in-town residential population when all of those other markets, the office workers, the conventioneers disappeared. All right, and so what is it now? 90,000 residents in downtown Seattle.
I think it's close to 100,000, maybe.
Yeah, and of course that depends on the boundaries you use. But that was a market where even if you were working from home, your home was in the downtown and you were feeding downtown businesses. So I think that was also a piece of it as well. So there's kind of that on the ground sort of creative collaboration that Sandy was getting at, and that there's also these larger market forces which have probably kind of deserve a lot of the credit for why downtown Seattle is in, relatively speaking, the position it's in.
And Tiffany, I know you mentioned this notion of these independent businesses as well. Are there specific examples of independent Seattle spirit retailers doing things that made them more successful than they anticipated during the pandemic?
Well, I can think of one off the top of my head, but I really wanted to lean into what Sandy said about the independent landlords. That is huge in Seattle. There's a lot of independent money, family money, independent businesses that were grown here. Some of them we know their names really well around Seattle, but I think that really helped, and I'm really happy that Sandy feels that helped her individually, because my experience with my landlords is that they're very supportive of their retail tenants, and universally across the board, that really helped. That partnership was strengthened, not weakened. And I absolutely think that that's because of Seattle. And I think that's because of who we are as a region. So Sandy, that's awesome. I love that. In terms of, well, this is my favorite one. It's not a downtown one, so I apologize, but it is a Seattle one. It's a Vietnamese coffee concept called Coffeeholics. They opened in Columbia City in the pandemic, a block off of Rainier, so they weren't even on a main street. They had a landlord in a small apartment building that took a risk with them and put them in on the main floor. They had lines around the block for the entire pandemic. I'm not exaggerating. And they just opened their second location in Greenwood. And I'm having lunch today with a client, a very large downtown landlord that wants them in a building in downtown Seattle. So, and they're just resilient. They're they're kind of the second generation of restaurateurs, and they brought a new modern flair to this concept, and it's addictive. It's addictive. And I think that they're a great example of, they just powered through it all. It's pretty amazing.
And in terms of other positives in downtown Seattle that set it apart, beyond that independent spirit, and are there things, Michael, about the mix of national and local independent retailers that make us that might present some challenges ahead, or that might make it easier? What's your sense about that?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that, I think it's almost impossible to talk about it without discussing what's always the elephant in the room of e-commerce and Amazon. I have a somewhat contrarian take on that. I think the threat to brick and mortar, and particularly to downtown and urban America, is overblown, and I can get into that. But I think to the extent that, retailers, whether they be legacy brick and mortar retailers or digitally native retailers, continue to open stores. Yeah. There is a flight to quality, as it were. Retailers, and Tiffany can certainly talk about this. They move in packs, right? And there's a safety in numbers mentality. And so downtown Seattle, as an established retail location with an already existing critical mass, that means something. Even if some of those brands that have been there for a long time have disappeared, there's still a lot of them still there. And that means something. And so I think as retailers of all types expand, as they are continuing to do, they look for those Class A locations. Sure. And downtown Seattle is still very much one of them. So I think that's now on the flip side, and this gets to the question of independence. I do think that the strongest business districts are always the most diversified on a number of levels, right? When it comes to submarkets, when it comes to different categories of retail, and when it comes to brands versus independents. And so, to the extent that downtown Seattle can create and/or keep that balance, I think that stands it in good stead going forward, because generally that's I think the sweet spot in consumer demand is that mix. So
I'll add something to that, Felix, and kind of a bigger, more global retail scale. During the last recession, I don't even want to call it the last recession, because I hope this is not a recession. So during the period of the 2008 recession, the national brands that ended up failing overall, they had some of their top performing units here in the Northwest. And that was really interesting to watch, because they did not want to close those stores. And they kept them open as long as they could. And then unfortunately, those brands would disappear. So people that were looking at the market that maybe didn't understand that would say, well, why did Circuit City close here? You know, it was always busy, or, you know, Hollywood Video and things like that. They really did perform really well in the Northwest. And so I think they try to hang on as long as they can on a national basis. And then they try to come back as quick as they can to Seattle, which is always really interesting. And Michael and I are huge fans of that mix of having both nationals and independence. And I think this might be an unpopular thing to say, but I think that it does provide good competition across the board. I think it makes the independents better. I think it makes them, you know, more resilient, more creative, more curated. I mean, I know why people want to go to Sandy's store and why she, you know, kicks butt over a lot of other people. And I think that the nationals, why that puts pressure on her financially and as an individual owner, I do think that it's good that we curate that mix in order to not only provide great services to all of the, you know, community, but also keeps everybody honest about what we're delivering from a retail perspective.
And Sandy, I think you've spoken before about there's a relationship. I mean, the large retailers from out, you know, and the big national retailers and the local retailers aren't completely separate. There's intermingling in a symbiotic relationship, right?
Exactly. I think my favorite meeting, a small roundtable meeting, was a meeting that I was at where Bruce Nordstrom was there. And he said out loud, you know, we can't exist, we, Nordstrom, cannot exist without the small, independent retailers. And I will also say that goes both ways. You know, we also cannot exist without Nordstrom. I love Nordstrom. I think that it's that mix that brings people downtown. It's, you know, it makes it more interesting than less, because in a more formalized or suburban, it's a lot of times less independent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the mix in downtown Seattle is what makes tourists and the people, you know, from the neighborhoods want to come downtown. I think we also have to think about getting people downtown. I think we need to get people to stop fearing coming downtown. And I believe that buildings that are managed by local owners often are much more accessible by the person on the street. For instance, the cleaning of it, the keeping of it, you know, the moving on of folks who maybe stayed overnight, versus sometimes buildings I see where nothing is done, you know, it's just not cleaned up. And then the MID comes in and does some cleaning, and that's great. But I think building owners need to take some pride in how they take care of their buildings, so that the people who are walking up and down the street feel comfortable to come in.
And I just want to shout out to DSA. I love all the DSA folks that are around wearing their coats and riding the bikes and picking up stuff. It's really noticeable, and it makes me feel really good. I office downtown Seattle, and I just love it. So little plug to DSA's workforce that's out there trying to help.
Absolutely.
And
Felix, good. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
No, I mean, the one point I wanted to add to that, and I know that kind of gets us on the subject that's on a lot of people's minds, but you know, I think one thing that downtown Seattle has historically had the advantage of is that you know, there isn't an enormous amount of competition for the tenants compared to other cities. You know, Manhattan has been dogged by high vacancy, retail vacancy for years now. Part of it is because, you know, they're constantly dumping another 1 million square feet of retail space here, the World Trade Center, another 1 million square feet of retail space here, Hudson Yards. At some point, you know, you're playing a game of musical chairs. Seattle, at least historically, you know, yes, there's Bellevue, there's University Village, but relatively speaking, you know, there aren't many alternatives, or haven't been. And in the last couple of decades, at the same time, Seattle itself has been growing. So your demand has been increasing at a time when your supply has stayed largely still. I think the dynamic changes, and maybe downtown Seattle's vulnerabilities become even more problematic if some new competitor materializes. You know, especially in as much as downtown Seattle draws from such a large catchment. And so if such a new competitor materializes in the city or just outside it, that could be a threat. So that's, on a citywide, region-wide perspective, I think that should be added to the conversation as well.
Yeah, and if certain issues that have been, that were present before the pandemic aren't properly addressed, that also becomes sort of, I think, pushing people away. And DSA recently sent a letter that was signed by dozens of local business leaders to multiple jurisdictions. Tiffany, you signed that letter, I think.
I did.
And why did you sign that letter? What did it say?
Well, I think, we're coming at this with such a positive, which is all real data and real information for the beginning of this webinar. But there's a lot of headwinds that are still out there for us, and I don't personally want to lose the momentum and the things that really make us great to some bickering in city council or policies that just absolutely have shown no probability of getting anything done progressively. So I was saying earlier to our smaller group that I feel like this is the most important local election coming up in my adult life, and I'm almost 50 years old. So we need to be doing something as a city. We need to care about downtown. Sandy, I'm probably going to list off a few things that are challenging to you, but with all this positivity we're talking about, there is supply chain issues. There's issues related to how much, you don't cook, Sandy, but how much the grease oil costs, for people to cook, electricity, construction costs are 50% higher, our, real estate taxes. There are so many headwinds that make it really challenging for small businesses. And if we have to add private security, to the list, I think that's really a big ask for us to hold together this community that we love in downtown Seattle. We need everybody to get out and vote and make a difference and help sort of fend off some of these things that we do have a say in and that we can control. So I signed that letter. By the way, I thought it was incredibly well written. If anybody has not read it, it's been all over the news. Go out and read it. And it was signed by a lot of really wonderful, dedicated people.
Yeah, and it asks for multiple things around like addressing homelessness, addressing repeat offenders, and retail theft in particular. I mentioned a program in San Francisco that's recently announced by the mayor down there. I think it was as recently as last month. Michael, do you know much about that program? Can you fill us in on what they're doing in the Bay Area around retail theft in particular?
Yeah. Retail, San Francisco downtown is probably, for so many reasons, the closest analog to downtown Seattle. In fact, I actually think downtown San Francisco, or Union Square, it's probably challenged to an even greater degree than downtown Seattle on these fronts, and has been for some time. There's been some big spaces that have gone empty, with some very prominent retailers leaving them. We lost a 40,000 square foot Gap, a 40,000 square foot Saks Off Fifth, a 44,000 square foot H&M, 43,000 square foot Forever 21, Marshalls, Uniqlo, Brooks Brothers as well, like Seattle. Several Walgreens have closed. In fact, Walgreens just announced another 5 store closures. That they're obviously closing across the country. But in most of these cases, at least the reasons they're citing have to do with the social problems. One very interesting data point, Walgreens, again, they're having larger issues at Walgreens, but they claim that, their San Francisco stores have 4 times the level of theft as their national average, and that they spend 35 times the amount on security than their national average. So, and this obviously has become even more of an issue on people's minds during the pandemic because it's not diluted. Actual crime in Union Square is actually below historical levels, but it's not diluted to the same degree that it normally is when there's so much foot traffic. So the mayor here has been trying to be proactive with stationing more ambassadors and working with businesses to the extent that the city and county can, to address the shoplifting. But it's certainly reaching crisis levels, and unfortunately is hitting the national press as well, which has all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of conventions and tourism and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and what they're planning in San Francisco is, is doubling the number of officers, increasing the, working with the state, all the jurisdictions, and really making it a forefront issue
Yeah,
to address the safety of employees and retail theft and all those things. And it's, we have a commenter in the question and answer box who's saying that our optimism about downtown isn't really addressing what's going on in Pioneer Square from his personal experience being in the office since March 2020. Optimism on downtown really has nothing to do with Pioneer Square. What, I don't know, Tiffany, what can you speak to that, Tiffany?
Thank you. And I read that and I really wanted the chance to say something about that. I totally agree. And I don't want to, by talking about the positive things that I think we have to leverage and we have to pay attention to the positive, we have to pay attention to the negative and what's going on. And there's two pockets in Seattle that are still very worrisome. Pioneer Square being one, and parts of the International District being the other. International District suffered a lot of racist attacks during the pandemic, and Pioneer Square lost sports, events, tourism, people that live there, and of course, employment. And those two areas are really, really struggling. And they're seeing, unfortunately, the brunt of all of this that still needs to be resolved. And so I did want to acknowledge that and say that I completely agree and understand and empathize. And that is one of the reasons I signed the letter. And the letter addresses all the things that you are concerned about, and I'm concerned. And that's why I think that this election is also so important. So just honoring that piece of it, it's very, very true. And it really hurts my heart, to be honest, to go down there. It's challenging.
Yeah,
No.
go ahead, Sandy.
I live in Pioneer Square, so I think that I worry about the fact that the actual business owners, the small business owners, while there is a kind of a business district there, I don't really find that much is happening because of it. I wish the city really would get more involved. I think the DSA has become involved. I think the DSA is trying to do events and things, a la Bryant Park in New York. I mean, that'd be great. What a success story that is. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Occidental Park became like that, or the area where the pergola is? But that is not what is happening at this time. And it makes it so difficult for the retailers to be there. And of course, I used to walk from my home in Pioneer Square to my work on First Avenue, which is about a 12-block walk and a wonderful walk. But there are just so many stories about old Asian ladies being knocked to the ground and beat up. I just decided that my children don't want me to become one of those either. I don't do it, and I want it to come back. I want to be able to walk from my home in Pioneer Square to my work on First Avenue between Union and Pike. And I think there's a lot of collaboration that has to happen there. It's not just the DSA. It's a city and the police department and the Department of Transportation. There's a lot that needs to be looked at it in a real on the ground way, not some big idea,
Mm-hmm. City attorney.
Mayor.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and even in several of the bullet points in that DSA letter ask for things that would specifically support,
Yes.
grants for private security, better cooperation between the police department and private security, and just a more comprehensive approach to an issue that, again, it was here before the pandemic. They got kind of backburnered, but it's going to come creeping, if not roaring back, as people come back to work. And there's another question in the box I want to ask about how much the return to office, which will be the topic of our next conversation in November, by the way, but we can't ignore it in a discussion about retail because, obviously, intuitively, so many people who come and work in Seattle during the day spend money on retail stuff while they're here. So what are your thoughts about what are the effects in the near term and the medium term in terms of people returning to the office on retail in Seattle? Who wants to take that one? Tiffany, Michael? Tiffany, go ahead.
I
Go ahead.
really want Michael to chime in because I think our comparison to other cities is really important. I think I've heard, and this is very anecdotal, so don't quote me on this, but I have a lot of sort of C-level friends, in and around Puget Sound, and I think overall it's a real mixed bag, and I think that some of the efficiencies are down by people not working. There's some real concerns about collaboration, the benefits of being together. That they're going to want to get back to work in some capacity. I think that so I'm not one of those people that feels like this is going to be completely change the landscape to something we can't recognize. I think we are going to see pockets of people coming back. We already have. If you work downtown, you're already seeing them. I've been back since August of 2020. I've seen it steadily improve, and so of course it matters. But I always tell people who aren't familiar with retail, it's not just employees. It's not just people that live there. It's not just tourists. It's not just the people going to the sports. It's the collective. And so, yes, when one sector is affected, of course, that affects this, but we're not going to lose this entire sector of employees. It's just going to be, maybe they come 3 days a week. And Michael, I turn this over to you because I thought you had a really wonderful observation about that in particular, even if they came 3 days a week or part-time or whatever it is.
Yeah. I think that, I looked at in terms of some numbers, and again, this is from the last 3 or 4 months, which is very much a moving target. As of, I think about June or July, it was about 35% of office workers had returned to their traditional office space, in a survey of about 10 major cities. That's overall. CBDs are a little different. Central business districts are a little different for a variety of reasons. In many cities, you often have to take transit to get to and from your job, which is a whole nother kettle of fish. And it's varied by cities. I would say that the large West Coast CBDs have fallen well below that 35%. Along with New York City and Boston and a few others. New York City, as of June, was at about 21% for its CBD office space. San Francisco is around there, if not lower. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One being that in some of these markets, particularly San Francisco and Seattle, a much larger percentage of the jobs can theoretically be done remotely. That's the downside of having a tech, social media focus of your regional economy. I think, and this is more anecdotal than it is data driven, because I haven't seen any research on it yet. I do sense there's a little bit more of a risk aversion on the West Coast with this pandemic and its variants. But I think and over time, there's a lot of estimates about how this is all going to settle. No one quite knows. I think the consensus right now is, you're probably going to get 20% fewer hours worked of your average employee in the office anywhere, But, the point that I had made and what Tiffany's referring to is that we're also not very sure how this will actually impact retail in the end. For instance, let's say you are going into the office 3 days a week and you're working from home 2 days a week. Well, if you're working from home 2 days a week and you're presumably eating lunch from your pantry, right? You've got 3 days where maybe you're like, okay, I've saved 2 days of lunch money. I can go to town and I can eat out all 3 days when I'm in the office. So, my point here is more that I think we with both of these issues, how many people ultimately work in offices and to what extent that impacts consumer demand. I think we still have a little ways to go before we see how this all plays out. We certainly have to wait and see what happens when that mythical time arrives, when the Delta variant is passed and offices are bringing back their workforces in earnest.
One point to layer into that is that our population, according to the Puget Sound Business Journal, I think is where it was, that is actually higher than it was in 2019, downtown population. Currently, it's because everybody moved back downtown. They're bored. They did their little hiatus and lived in Sun Valley or wherever they went, and they came back. And they're living downtown, even if they're not allowed to go to their office that's 3 blocks away. They're living downtown. They're choosing to be downtown. And I think anybody from about 24 to 35, my daughter's 23, want to be at the office for for at least some period of time. So we don't know. We don't know. We're talking about the activity that we see downtown. Of course, it has an impact, but we're all watching it like everybody else, and assuming that the trends about human nature, about being with people, and et cetera, are going to play itself out to have more people being around.
I have one other thing, but Sandy, I want you to have a chance to talk before I add my addition. No? Yeah, I mean, the one other thing I was going to say is I think with a lot of these things, so much of what we expect or fear is rooted in our own frame of reference. A lot of the people commenting on what will happen with the return to office are of older generations. Many of them are living very settled lives. I think we all remember when we were in our 20s work from home would have sounded like an absolute nightmare. But also with regard to the public safety issue, and I certainly don't want to minimize that. I think it's also important to remember that a lot of us Generation X and older, we lived through a time in urban America where many people avoided downtown out of fear. Younger people, millennials, and especially Gen Z, they don't have that frame of reference. Their whole adult lives have been lived during a stretch when urban America and downtown was a place you wanted to be and you were not scared to be. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because that might also impact the way they're feeling about urban and downtown settings now, how safe they feel, or how much of it is a concern or a deal breaker of a concern. And also with return to the office, they're at life stages where, especially Gen Z, they are in, courtship phase. They're in friends formation stage. They're in career advancement stage, all of which is in person. So I think that's another dimension to add to this conversation.
Yeah. And in terms of that generational fear about downtown, I don't think that's true in Seattle. I think 25 years ago, Seattle was sleepy and they kind of rolled up the sidewalks at night. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the issues around fear of downtown and people expressing that, from their suburban locations, or about, trepidation about certain blocks and stuff, that's relatively recent. That's in the last couple of decades in my experience. So I'm not sure how that will pan out here, but go ahead, Sandy.
I think that the concept of block to block is something that I, experienced in New York in the 80s, right? I mean, there were places you just didn't go. A cab driver wouldn't take me. But now I believe that in Seattle, there is unfortunately this thing. And I think we created it by allowing the Department of Transportation to have such excitement over 3rd Avenue. Oh, it was going to be such a beautiful thoroughfare. And we all know that it has become a very difficult place for people to catch a bus, which is what it's supposed to do, make the buses go back and forth. I think it is up to us to try to figure out how to change that. I was at one of the soft openings of the Wild Ginger, which is on 3rd and Union last night. That is such an exciting thing. I mean, that is an example of a local retailer who is putting his heart right there on the line. I feared so much that he would close that location because he has other locations. I think that's what we are looking for, that commitment. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people like myself who are committed, and much bigger than myself that are committed. I think that's what we have to see. And I think that this new round of, is it round 6 that the mayor has announced about grants, I think that will help. I think that all the stuff like that is very helpful, because honestly, this is a very challenging time to survive. And I think even though it looks great, we all put our best foot forward. Excuse me, this is tough. We don't really understand what's coming, and it's like hope, right? And a lot of it for me, and I think for other retailers, and this is what my shoppers, my clientele who's local understands, I love my town. That's why I'm still there. I believe that the majority of small retailers, they're still here because they love their town. You can walk away from any lease, but we want Seattle to continue to be, it's not going to be easy. There are so many things that we're facing. I think that we just have to feel like we're facing them together, and we little retailers need that support from the city, from the police. We already get it from the Department of the DSA and the MIT, the Metropolitan Improvement District and our landlords, but it's a group effort. No question about it.
Yeah. And Sandy, thanks to you and people like you who do love Seattle and commit their lives and their working lives to making the city great with businesses like yours. That's just, and you could have panel discussions all day, but if there weren't people like you and other business owners, putting everything they have on the line to offer what you do, that's great. That's why I love Seattle. It's stuff you can't really quantify. It's a strange sort of maybe we can reel off all these statistics and look at what other cities are doing. Seattle's always had this sort of, I don't know, secret sauce that has made it kind of resilient to all these different challenges. And, this is the historian part of me, but whether it was, the Great Depression or World War II, or even just the Great Recession that we came out of relatively well compared with other parts of the country, 12 years ago.
Well, some of these issues are real firebrands. I mean, they cause a lot of controversial other topics to bubble up. We all are very opinionated about it all, but I really applaud you, Sandy, for your spirit. It's why I love what I do. It's why I love that I have this tiny little part of the whole process because of people like you. And I just wanted to pause and say that it makes me inspired. I love Seattle, and I really appreciate that. These are all hard issues. We're going to get a lot of challenging conversation around it. And thank you for living it and really taking each step forward with humility and optimism.
I'm going to write in Sandy for mayor right now on my
Right.
ballot,
Right.
absentee ballot. No, and seriously, I mean,
Right.
that's, I fantasize about that kind of leadership where someone gets up and says all these things like you say, Sandy, about how much we love Seattle. And here's the issues. Here's how each of us can make a difference in those issues in little ways to move us all forward collectively. That's what I lay awake at night craving that because it affects everybody on the granular level on up to the big picture level too. So
Right.
and in that spirit, looking ahead at some bigger projects. I mean, Seattle there's so much stuff in the pipeline, whether it's additional transit, the way the waterfront is being reimagined. In our prep meeting a couple of days ago, we talked about some other parts of the country where there's some big projects that might have lessons for us. I wanted to touch on those a little bit here before we had about 10 minutes left. One part we talked about was the Seaport District in Boston, and if there were lessons in there that might still be applied to the waterfront or any other redevelopment of parts of downtown Seattle. And I think Tiffany, you visited there.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael, you've done work there. Tiffany, what was your experience of visiting the Seaport District? And first, for those who don't know what it is, give a little description of what it is.
Well, I don't really know what the intention was, but it's basically, I take it as a sort of a tech district where a bunch of big tech companies and offices and then housing and retail all kind of exploded on this other part of, I think it's the South.
Yeah, it was like a brownfield. I lived there 25 years ago.
Yeah.
It was just almost an industrial area. It was almost deserted. It was
Almost
empty
like
at
our
night.
South
Yeah,
Lake Union.
pretty much like South Lake Union. Yeah.
I took it like South Lake Union is what
Yeah.
I think what they did really, really well. I dare say, I don't want to say better or worse, but what they did really well is they felt like they incorporated a lot of community involvement, community green space, community space in general. So they had little micro retail opportunities for really, really tiny retailers or digitally native companies that they brought in there. They had some open space for people to use technology for free, yoga out on the lawn. I mean, I just felt like they did a lot to try to get the community engaged beyond office, restaurants, homes. Or apartments. I really liked it a lot. I thought it was really beautifully done. Michael brought up some interesting points about it when we discussed it, but I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, a couple of things about the Seaport District. Well, three things. One, it was mostly a master planned effort on the part of the Boston Planning and Development Agency. What has been there since the start is the Boston Convention Center. So that was an initial anchor. And as Tiffany mentioned, it has since been populated, with a lot of mixed use development, higher end residential, a lot of the hot retail concepts, including digitally native ones that we all have come to know. And I think that gets to the last point the second point I want to say about it, which is that if you look at Boston, and again, looking in terms of the competitive context, before the Seaport, if you were a brand like a Warby Parker, you really had one place to turn. You really went to Newbury Street. You went to Back Bay. There weren't many alternatives. Seaport District has kind of created an alternative in the heart of Boston. So I think the competitive context is part of this as well, that it was an alternative to Newbury Street, to Copley Plaza, where it's been criticized, and this might be something that's unique to Boston in the particular moment that it's in, where it's been criticized is that not only is it overly glossy, but it is overwhelmingly white, or at least that's how it's perceived, that the Boston Planning and Development Agency failed in the respect that they created something which ultimately became kind of a tone deaf enclave. Now, this is obviously an issue on the national level, but in Boston has particular resonance. They too are in the midst of a mayoral campaign, which has been quite astounding in that the 4 finalists and now the 2 in the runoff were all women, and all 4 of them were people of color. And that's a pretty big deal in Boston. So they're having a moment there which might be specific to their history. But that said, if you read the Boston Globe on a regular basis, there's routinely negativity thrown in the direction of the Seaport District as an example, at least as it pertains to inclusivity, of what not to do. Even though in conventional metrics, retail mix, property values, it's been an astounding success.
Let's get to a couple of local questions here in the last few minutes we have. It's a question about looking at the long-term strategy of Third Avenue. What is the right transportation retail mix to make it more viable and effective? Sandy, do you want to take a whack at that?
Well, I think there has to be something that is done to make it more friendly for people to walk around there. And I honestly, it's a very difficult question, because when the Department of Transportation came out with, we're going to make Third Avenue into what they made it into, they really didn't have any thought about how that would affect the pedestrian traffic. I mean, it truly did not. I was at those meetings, and some of us stood up and said, what's going to happen here? And they believed in their vision of this wonderful movement of buses, all the time. I think that maybe it means that we need to have people who can chat with and help the Department of Transportation become a more user-friendly to human beings organization, where they see that what they do truly affects the heart of the city, as it has on Third Avenue. I don't have a fix. I'm just really proud of Rick Shorter for opening the Wild Ginger, and I will go there a lot.
Well, I think other parts of the city and other parts of the region, frankly, it's always a plus for retailers to be located on a transit line. And Third Avenue is an exception to that. And I agree. And I think public safety is a huge, huge part of that. And a good user experience. I'd rather catch the bus on Capitol Hill than downtown. So I agree.
We have certain very unique things. We're narrow, right? And we have narrow streets. And we can't, making them wider, a lot of times we're kind of compared to Portland, where when they put in the streetcars in Portland, it was a new thing, and it's very wide. So the sidewalks remain very wide. And there's still room for all this streetcar stuff, you know, and the Pearl District grew up from that streetcar. It's different here in Seattle, so we have to approach it differently because our streets are narrow, and we have to think about how we can keep it pedestrian friendly as well as bus friendly.
Okay, this question, I'd ask this question to you, Tiffany. This is from the chat box. What are your thoughts about filling the big box areas of Pine Street, Macy's, Forever 21, Pacific Place, and Westlake? Throw in Banana Republic too.
Oh my God. Before I did, I did, other brokers are working on those assignments. I probably don't want to say too much because I want them to, everybody has these dreams. I had somebody one time who wanted Nordstrom to be in like Moses Lake. I mean, it's, you know, people's visions and reality don't always necessarily go together, but I did want to say one thing, because I disagree with this, Ron, who put a note in here about the seaport. I'm a close the looper. And I do want to say, I totally agree with you, Ron, even though I said it was a cool way to do a new concept. And I enjoyed seeing how they integrated the kind of community and free space. I agree with you. I felt it was very vanilla, and we would not want all of Seattle to be that way. So I do want to say that sometimes it's hard when you build a totally new project that's all steel and glass, and how to make it cool and interesting. And that's what I think that they did, you know, fairly well on that. The big box stuff, my God, people have been asking me that for almost my entire career, almost 20 years. And it always needs to, you will see it in a new iteration of something in these spaces, whether it's a highly curated customer experience, whether it's a shallow in the store, deep online. I mean, you're going to see those spaces used in different ways, either by traditional retailers or something completely different. And like I said, I don't want to lead any of those people that are working on those assignments one way or another, because it's fabulous real estate, and it's gonna be great. I really believe that.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to give each of you 10 seconds. So it's a pretty short assignment to tell me one thing from the pandemic that created by the pandemic that was positive and that you hope continues into the future. Michael, you go first. 10 seconds.
Oh God, I have to go first.
Yes.
I think what's interesting, and we didn't talk on.
Okay, your time's up. No, just kidding.
I mean, let me talk about something specifically downtown Seattle. I think to Tiffany's point, a lot of retailers think like Warren Buffett, right? Be greedy when others are fearful, and they'll keep coming, and they'll keep trying to build better mousetraps. And the key is, do you have the real estate where they're going to want to be when they do that? That's what downtown Seattle is, and that's what it will likely remain. So,
okay. How about you, Sandy? 10 seconds. Something that's going to continue in the future, you hope.
Well, I think that we have all learned to pivot in many, many ways. And I think that, you know, for bricks and mortar like me, we have learned to face the need for social media, for online, and become that more flexible person in the same way that Nordstrom is. And I think that that is, you know, retail is going to have to learn to do that mix, bring the people in safely, and also be out there on the, you know, World Wide Web.
Very good.
But I think
I've heard of it.
But I do think that that is a lesson that we have all learned and will continue with.
Very good. How about you, Tiffany? 10 seconds.
Oh, so many, but for my little tiny space, I will say that the appreciation for the small business and the independent business has been the best thing that has come out of this. I used to be called the mom and pop broker way back in the day, and even though I, you know, represent Trader Joe's, but I love our independent nature, our retailers like Sandy, and it has been such an amazing thing to experience that now everybody is also realizing how important that group is.
Very good. All right, I want to thank our panelists, Michael J. Byrne, Tiffany Connell, and Sandy Luhaler. Thank all of you for joining us today for DSA Virtual Access and our discussion of the retail road ahead. I want to thank John Scholes, Sally Wright, James Cito, Emily Baylor, and Elliot Kravenko of DSA, and special thanks to sponsor Alaska Airlines. Please do plan on joining us again on Thursday, November 18th, when we'll be focusing on the return to office in downtown. Mark your calendar for 9 a.m. on November 18th and watch your email box for more information in the weeks ahead. Until then, I'm Felix Bonnell for DSA. Thanks for joining us this morning. See you downtown, and go Hawks.
Thank you, Felix.